I'm very excited to introduce Krishna. He's a scientific director at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems and a professor at the University of Saarland in Germany. His research interests are in the measurement, analysis, design, and evaluation of complex internet-scale systems, in particularly social computing systems. His work on fair machine learning, social online networks, and media internet access networks, as well as peer-to-peer system, has received numerous awards in the computer science community, and is continuously inspiring in the space of normative questions regarding ethics and fairness of complex systems. It's my pleasure to introduce Krishna at today's keynote, and he'll be talking about fairness in multi-sided and multi-stakeholder online platforms. Krishna, if you'd like to share your screen and start. We can see your screen, by the way.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for both inviting me and for attending the talk. Today, I'm going to tell you about some of the challenges more than solutions that we faced when we try to tackle some issues related to fairness in multi-sided or multi-stakeholder online platforms. So let me get started. Oops. Oh, yes. So the sort of systems that I'm going to talk about today are human AI collaborative decision-making systems. And these are systems where you have increasingly algorithms assisting or nudging or overseeing human decisions. And these sorts of systems are increasingly pervading every aspect of our lives. For example, today you have risk prediction algorithms where assessments of where the next crime is likely to happen, or which employee is likely to leave, or which child is at a greater risk of injuring themselves, are essentially influencing human decisions. And similarly, there are numerous match and market making algorithms on gig economy platforms like Uber, Airbnb, and Kickstarter that are increasingly influencing how riders are essentially assigned to drivers, or how hosts meet travelers, and so on. And finally, you also have search recommender and reputation algorithms on sites like Google, Facebook, and Twitter that are increasingly mediating social discourse and influencing who we meet, what sort of news we see, and increasingly our whole worldview as well. Now, given the sort of impact these algorithms are having on our societal lives, it's only natural that there have been numerous concerns that arose over the past several years about their fairness. And these concerns are of a variety, are quite varied in nature. For example, there are concerns about discrimination in predictive risk analytics algorithms. So here, what I'm showing is a headline article from ProPublica that talks about machine bias, that there is a software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it is biased against minorities, and in this particular case, blacks. And the country that they're referring to is the US. And then there are concerns about opacity or lack of transparency about market-making algorithms. And here, again, I'm showing a headline from Wall Street Journal news article that was talking about how Amazon non-transparently changes search algorithms in ways that boosts its own products at the expense of its competitors. And finally, there have been numerous concerns raised about implicit biases in search and recommender systems. And here I'm showing an example of a New York Times article that was talking about how the German news viewers were being led by YouTube towards increasingly far extremist views of the articles. Now, in response to all these concerns, there has been a lot of work that has been kickstarted in the research community, and I would. And this is perhaps a bit of a caricature, and it's not a perfectly fair thing to say, but I would go out on a little bit on the limb and say that we have done a lot of work on fairness, on algorithmic fairness, but a whole bunch of it is largely motivated by the applications of risk assessments. There are numerous notions and very interesting notions of individual and group fairness that have been proposed in this context. There have been numerous operationalizations of these notions. That is, what I mean by operationalization is once you have a notion, how do you define a formal measure or objective that interprets what the notion is about? There has been a lot of work on algorithmic methods that have been proposed to achieve the desired objectives. But I would like to sort of contextualize this work by saying a lot of the time, many of these works are studying the problem from the perspective of a single side or one set of stakeholders. And that's often because in predictive risk assessment situations, oftentimes there is one set of stakeholders. And what I mean by this is, for example, if you take recidivism risk prediction, there is one set of stakeholders, which are the defendants, and you want to be fair in terms of your assessments across the defendants. But sometimes when you begin to go to multi-sided platforms, and what I mean by multi-sided platforms are platforms like gig economy platforms like Uber, where you have multiple stakeholders, like you have drivers, riders, and Uber platform itself. And then if you consider an e-commerce platform like Amazon, you have consumers, producers, sellers of the product, and then Amazon as a platform itself. And similarly, if you think of online conference scheduling platforms, you have the stakeholders are presenters and attendees. And finally, when you think about online charity platforms like DonorsChoose, you have different sets of stakeholders like donors and recipients. And the point that I would like to raise is that in these multi-sided or multi-stakeholder platforms, the fairness concerns become a lot more intriguing or interesting or complicated, whatever way you want to think about it. It's because your algorithm not only needs to be fair, for example, in the context of Uber, amongst all the drivers and amongst all the riders, but you would also have to trade off the beneficial outcomes for drivers with those of riders and vice versa. So in that sense, multi-stakeholder online platforms raise a lot more challenging fairness concerns. And those are the ones that I'm going to focus on in this talk. So my talk has two parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about some work we did about a gig economy platform, which is Ridehailing Platforms. This is a work that we published at KDD 2019, in case if you would like to look up for more details. And later on, I'm going to focus on an online donation platforms, which is DonorsChoose.org. So let's get started with the first part. So pretty much every one of you would have been familiar with ride-hailing platforms like Lyft or Uber, and what these platforms fundamentally do is they have algorithms that are matching drivers to passengers. It's this matching algorithm that we would like to focus on. Now, there have been numerous concerns raised about these platforms and concerns for the stakeholders in these platforms. So, for example, from the perspective of the riders, there are numerous concerns about the amount of waiting time or the surge pricing that riders are subjected to. And from the perspective of the drivers, there have been numerous concerns raised about whether they're able to earn a decent living wage when they are participating in these platforms. Now, to motivate some of the fairness concerns, I'm going to start with the data set that we gathered. This is an anonymized data set. It came from an Asian taxi riding platform. This is actually a platform where it's not a gig economy platform. It is a big taxi company that essentially was doing the task of ride distribution across 15,000 drivers, and there were over 4.6 million ride assignments that we analyzed as part of this. And in this particular situation, there are always more drivers than there are passengers requesting rides. So in that sense, this data set is one unique situation where you have a ride-hailing platform with always more drivers than there are ride requests.
Vous avez une
So, okay. So one of the first things that we did once we got the data was to actually analyze the distribution of the driver income. And here what I'm showing is essentially, for those of you who are familiar, it's a Lorenz curve. And what I'm showing in this graph along x-axis is the cumulative percentage of drivers. And along y-axis, what I'm showing is the percentage of income that they earned because out of the ride assignments in this data set. And so if every driver got an equal share of the revenue, then essentially the curve would follow the black dots. And any curve that is below this dotted black line, it suggests that there is an inequality in the income distribution. And so what this plot shows us is, if you looked at the top 20% of the most successful drivers, they are earning 40% of the total outcome. Oops, of the 40% of the total income. And if you look at the bottom 50% of the least successful drivers, they're earning about 27% of the total income. I'm sorry for the slide changes. I'm not really sure what is going on. Excuse me about that. So the bottom line is there is a significant inequality in the income that is earned. Now, at this point, some of you might be wondering, could it just be because of the amount of time that the drivers are available to drive on these platforms? And actually, that's not the case. And what I'm showing in this graph here is essentially that a similar pattern is observed even when you normalize the incomes of the drivers by the number of hours they were driving. So the blue dots show the income per active hours for drivers. And what you can see is a significant difference in the amount of earnings they're receiving because of the rides they were assigned. Now, this got us thinking about whether this is a more broader problem and whether we could think of a more fair ride-hailing algorithmic designs. And so to do this, let's start with a simple model of a ride-hailing platform. So we can think of essentially a time axis, and you have drivers available at different points of time, and then you have riders available at different points of time. And then essentially you could think of the ride-hailing platform as producing a sequence of matches between drivers and passengers over time. That's fundamentally what is going on. Now, what we thought we would model this as, to gain some traction on the problem, is to group passenger requests arriving within a short period of time. That is, we define epochs, and then we say you could think of essentially doing a matching between the requests that arrive within a period of time, like time in the epoch 1, epoch 2, and so on, with the drivers that are available during that epoch. So essentially, what you can view this problem as is one of repeated matchings. So in each epoch, you have a certain number of drivers that are available and certain number of requests that are coming. And then essentially what the ride-hailing algorithm is doing is essentially doing a matching. And you could think of this as one of like repeated matchings over time. Now, depending on the number of drivers or riders that are available, sometimes you will have a complete matching for the drivers, or sometimes you have complete matching for the riders. Like here, you have complete matching for the riders, and I guess here you have complete matching for the drivers in the second epoch. Now, the question is, then the next part of modeling is modeling some sort of a utility function for both sides. Now here, a typical way to think about this would be that there is a taxi and it's at a certain distance. It's at a certain distance from the passenger who is requesting the ride. And then this passenger would want to get to a certain destination, and there is a certain distance here as well. So you could think of the utility for the passengers as the amount of time that they would spend waiting for the taxi to arrive, which could be which could be captured by some negative function of the distance. And similarly, we could simply define utility for drivers as the effective distance that is traveled. And what we mean by effective distance is this is a distance for which they would get the fare, which is the distance that the passenger travels, minus the distance that they would have to travel to pick up the passenger in the first place. Now, these are just some simple utility functions. Of course, you could define a variety of different utility functions. Now, once you model the problem this way, the utilities naturally capture preferences. That means once you have a bunch of drivers and riders, essentially these utilities end up defining for each passenger what their preferred ordering of the drivers is. And for each driver, it also defines a preferred ordering over all the passengers. And now the advantage of modeling it this way is essentially now this boils down to a problem of how to fairly match preferences across both sides. And this sort of a mapping is useful because there is a long history of works on fair matching. And there are lots of interesting matching markets that have been studied, ranging from school admissions to kidney exchanges. But the one thing that the existing works do not consider is fairness of repeated matchings over time. So the real interesting question is, how do we think about fairness in these repeated matchings that is modeled by ride-hailing platforms? Now, once again, here, the idea is quite simple. And we thought, well, you could think of amortized parity. And what we mean by that is, in some sense, over time, you want to sum up the utilities of all drivers that they get in each of the epochs. And what you might want is the sum of the utilities across the different repeated matchings for the drivers to be equal. Now, of course, you could also have a slightly different notion that takes into account the amount of time that the drivers are active. And also you could take into account other sorts of additional features like the ratings of the drivers and the type of car that they're driving and so on. These are things that you could utilize, that you could incorporate in the definition of the utility function. And you can also define some similar notions of fairness for the passengers as well. Now, once we have this sort of a model, let's see how some naive methods that only consider the preferences for one side work compared to the ones that consider preferences for both sides. Let's start with some very simple methods that consider only one side. So, for example, if your algorithm is only considering the preferences for the drivers or preferences for the riders, you would pick the algorithm nearest driver first, which is you just assign each passenger to the nearest driver to them. The other way of thinking about the one-sided algorithm is you pick the driver who is worst off so far in terms of their utility. So this driver could be somewhere very far off. These two represent, in some sense, two extremes of algorithms where you're only considering the fairness from one side and you're ignoring the other side completely. Now, when you look at the performance of this NDF and WDF, what you notice is that the inequality in driver income, when you take the WDF, which considers the driver's perspective, it comes down to 0 compared to the inequality that exists before in the other side, in the nearest driver first. But there is a problem. While on the driver's front, the WDF does extremely well, its performance is really bad in terms of if you consider other factors, like from the perspective of the riders, in terms of the average waiting time for the riders. And here you see that the green and the orange curves completely swap. With WDF, the average waiting time can go significantly higher than with NDF, which is what you would expect as well. And because of the long waiting times, the overall system itself is less efficient, and the overall average monthly income across all the drivers also ends up decreasing. So the point is, just trying to think of this from a single side is potentially risky. So let's try out another idea, which is, what if we took both sides together, right? And one way to take both sides into account is you define some sort of an inequality function over the utilities for the riders, for the drivers, and you define a inequality measure over the utilities received by the passengers. And then you put some weight lambda and 1 minus lambda. This is a tunable parameter to trade off between the inequalities in the utilities for both sides. Now, of course, then the interesting question is, like, what sort of utility function would you define? Now, the temptation here we had was to start with some inequality indices that exist in the economics literature, but the problem is oftentimes they're very hard to solve for. So we went for a slightly simpler proxy for inequality, which is we tried to define inequality as the difference between the driver that has the maximum utility and any other driver. So you're comparing with the driver with the maximum utility or the passenger with the maximum utility. And you're trying to minimize the difference between these utilities. Now, I'll skip over the details, but you can, at this point, with these definitions, you can actually cast this as a problem, as an assignment problem, where the goal is to get the minimum cost one-sided perfect matching. The reason you have one-sided perfect matching is because the situation that we're considering is one where there are always more drivers. So you want to get the perfect matching, that is, every rider should get assigned a driver, but you want to have some minimum cost, which is shown above, which is just a formal way of representing what I mentioned on the previous slide. Now, it turns out that, of course, you could cast this as an integer linear programming problem, but in this particular case, you can actually have a solution with bounded complexity, because this is a well-studied problem in fair matching literature, and you can use the existing solutions. Now, let's quickly take a look at the resulting performance. Now, here, what I'm showing is the average monthly income that the drivers earn. This is the NDF and the WDF, which are the naive one-sided methods that I talked about before. And here I'm showing the results for various different values of lambda. And the high order takeaway is that when you try to simultaneously optimize for both sides, you can actually ensure higher average income for the drivers, while simultaneously keeping the inequality low. Low compared to the extreme one-sided algorithms. And similarly, if you look at the waiting times, you also get similar sorts of benefits with various different values of lambda. You can trade off the waiting time as well. So I'm going to quickly move over to the sort of open questions that we had after we did this work. We view this as a very, very preliminary work in this space. And there are a number of open questions. For example, we never studied the real world scenario where you actually have, there are times when drivers are more scarce than riders. And in fact, it can toggle, the scarcity can toggle from one side to the other side. And we haven't studied how well these sorts of algorithms would perform in those situations. And then there is a whole bunch of normative questions, which are very important. For example, there is a question of whether algorithms should try to compensate for poor location decisions made by drivers and riders. And what I mean by that is today, oftentimes drivers have strategies for locating their cars at particular places in the hopes of getting a better price or a quick ride request. Whereas here we're suggesting that algorithms compensate for that. And there is this question of, is it actually a better system design to just to keep the matching algorithm simple and understandable and transparent, and let drivers and riders make the choices themselves? And then there is the other bigger question of when service requests when service requests and processing are distributed across space and time, are there some procedural fairness considerations? And what I mean by this, and the best way to explain this is, imagine how rides are assigned when you walk out of a train station or an airport. When all the drivers and riders are at the same location in space, then essentially queuing is a simple procedural way of procedurally fair way of assigning rides and riders to drivers. The longest driver gets the next ride, longest waiting driver gets the next ride, and the longest waiting rider gets the next ride. But the problem, of course, is when these riders and drivers are distributed over space, and then you have these requests coming at different points of time, it's not really clear how to compensate for it. And it raises some very interesting questions. So with that, I'm going to move on to very quickly to the second part, where I'm going to talk briefly about some work we started doing in the online donation platforms. And this is some work that we published at CSCW. Actually, this should be 20, not 19. So the topic for this is the focus is, we're going to focus on educational charities here. And the high level idea is that we're going to focus on public school funding in the US, which is widely accessible and free of charge, all the public schools. And the question is about the funding of these public schools. Today, they're funded by a combination of federal, state, and local taxes. Now, here, what I'm showing in this graph is the funding that schools receive from local sources. This is local property taxes. What I'm showing along x-axis are schools grouped based on the percentage of students that attend that school district that are from the poor families. So every school district gets a score based on the percentage of students attending the district that are from poor families, and we group them and we divided these into percentiles. So each point here represents one percentile of the distribution. And what I'm showing here is the distribution on the y-axis is the average per capita, that is per student funding that is given for over a year from the local sources. And as you can see, there is a wide range of local funding here. And then here, this is often complemented by state and federal funding. And if you notice here, the state and the federal funding tries to compensate for the inequality in the local taxes. But at the same time, if you look at the y-axis, the scale of the y-axis, they're not able to completely compensate for the inequality in local taxes. So as a result, if you looked at the overall funding, there is still a significant inequality in per student funding that is that the schools receive in the US public schools receive. So given this inequality, there are often needs that are not met, and this has given rise to educational charities, and there are a variety of them that are increasingly becoming popular, like Digital Wish, Adopt a Classroom, and DonorsChoose. And in this talk, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on DonorsChoose and what DonorsChoose, and I'm just showing you a screenshot that I took this morning from DonorsChoose, and what it shows is there are like 55,000 projects that are currently live, and essentially you have a variety of ways in which you could search for the project, and you could apply a variety of search filters, and there is information about how much donation is still needed. Now, the important or the interesting thing is that all donation requests on DonorsChoose are verified, and therefore there is no spam. You don't have to worry that something is actually a spam, because they verify that it's only teachers at these public schools that are allowed to post legitimate requests on these sites. And these sites have these donation requests are often organized like Kickstarter campaigns. There is a time frame before which you have to receive the requested donation, and if you don't, then essentially the request fails and it won't be funded if you don't receive the full funding. And the data set that we analyzed is from 2002 to 2016. This was a data set that DonorsChoose itself released. There was over $500 million donated to 1 million projects, posted by 70,000 schools and from 1,500 school districts. This is about 9% of all school districts. So 90% of the school districts are actually not represented on DonorsChoose. And that's an important thing to also remember. And on average, every year, there is about 70% success rate for these projects. Now, the key question that we were interested in is, are the donations on DonorsChoose at least going preferentially towards the poorer school districts? Because you would expect that at least that might be happening. And this is what we wanted to check. So the first thing we did was we looked at the number of requests that are being donation projects or requests that are being posted by schools with varying levels of poverty. And this poverty is once again being measured by percentage of students from poor families. And there are some well-defined thresholds for defining what constitutes a poor family. And what you notice is you do have more requests from overall poorer school districts. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the average amount per student that is being requested as part of these requests, it actually goes the other way. There is less funds requested per capita from poorer school districts. And the reason for this is the sum of the poorer school districts are significantly larger. And as a result, when you normalize for it, it goes lower. Then let's look at success rate and the amount received. Now, when you look at the average success rate, the interesting thing is overall, you have a similar sort of a success rate across the board. The success rate for projects varies between 70 to 75%. Now, on first glance, we thought this is great. It doesn't depend on the poverty level. But on second thought, you might wonder, is it actually good that the success rate is completely independent of poverty level? Is that what constitutes equitable donations for the success rate to be completely independent of the poverty level? And then we also looked at the average donation that is received per student. And because even though the success rate is the same, because the per student amount that is requested is lower in the first place, as I showed on the previous slide, in general, if you look at the per capita flow of funds on DonorsChoose, you'd actually, the poorer school districts are per student receiving lesser amount, even on these online charity sites. And that's the point that I wanted to make. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this, including, I'm going to just skip over this slide in the interest of time, but including the fact that that sometimes the teachers from the richer school districts are more well connected, and they can actually ask their parent-teacher organizations to bootstrap the requests with funding. The thing that I actually wanted to focus on then is to understand, what we wanted to understand is to what extent are these donation requests or the donation or the flow of donations being influenced by the choice architecture on the site. And what I mean by choice architecture is essentially how the site is designed to make people choose what projects to fund. So for example, the search boxes can have a big impact. The search filters that that are being suggested can have a big impact. The default ranking can have a big impact. And then the way the project is being described, the project listing can have a big impact. And we wanted to understand to what extent these things are influencing it. So we had an experimental setup. And the way at a very high level the setup works is we recruited crowd workers to make donations. And the way we tried to, the way we studied it is we asked them to go through a proxy that we controlled. And what the proxy website was doing was it was intercepting the web pages from DonorsChoose on the fly, and we were changing the web pages. So the crowd workers are thinking that they're browsing the DonorsChoose.org, but we are changing them in ways with some treatments to see what impact redesigning the site might have on the decisions that the crowd workers would make to donate the money. Now, we gave each worker a virtual $100 to donate. And on average, a crowd worker took about 10 minutes, and we paid them $3 for doing the task. In addition, we gave them a $1 bonus, which we said that they could choose to donate a portion of that to the site in reality. And this is the portion that we actually donated to the DonorsChoose.org as well. And the reason why we did this is to make them actually feel involved in contributing some of their own bonus money that we're giving them to these things. Now, in terms of setup for the overt, we introduced two types of nudges. The first is an overt nudge. This is one where on every listing, the one here at the top left is the default one. And what we showed instead is the bottom right, where we explicitly highlight the poverty level of the school district from which the request is, or from the school from which the request is coming. And you can think of this as a conscious, as an overt nudge, because it can induce a conscious response. Similarly, we also set up a covert nudge. Sorry for the mistyping in the title. Here, what we just did was we changed the default ranking from most urgent to the highest economic need. And the expectation is that this sort of covert nudge might induce an unconscious response. Now, here is the high order experimental result, which I'm showing here in this graph. When the blue bars are showing the donation, we grouped all the schools into four categories: low poverty, moderate poverty, high poverty, and highest poverty. And the blue bars are the number of requests or projects that come from each of these groups. The green shows what would happen if people followed the traditional DonorsChoose.org design. The red shows what happens when we did an overt nudge, where we explicitly stated the poverty level on the project listing, and the purple one shows the default ranking, where we change the default ranking. Now, the high-level takeaway is that there is a significant difference. In fact, both the covert and the overt nudges that we introduced move the donations significantly towards schools that have higher poverty level. Now, we wanted to test whether people actually realize this. So we actually asked them at the end of the donation process, what actually influenced your choice of donations? And then, surprisingly for us, it turns out that when we provided explicit poverty information, many people said poverty level influenced their decisions. Whereas in the covert nudge, even though more of the donations went for the ones which are poorer districts, they actually didn't recognize it. So in other words, what happened here is, in an overt nudge, people were overestimating the impact of the treatment, and in a covert nudge, they were underestimating the impact of the treatment, even though they were subconsciously transferring even more of their donations towards the poorer school districts. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop here because I'm sorry for running a little bit over time. I do have some open questions, but I guess I'll bring this up in the panel, and I don't want to take the time away from Ashish's talk. I guess we started a little late, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Krishna. This was super interesting. And no worries, we started a little bit late, so thank you for being flexible on this timing. So we will have just a minute for questions. If anyone has questions, please add them to the Q&A, and we will try to answer there. I have one question to start with, which is just, I'm wondering, what kind of nudges, did you try different kind of nudges? Which are the ones that you found to be like helpful, or is there some sort of like diversity in nudging concepts that you thought about?
Yes. So these are things that I could bring this up in the panel discussion afterwards as well. On the DonorsChoose.org sites, there are a variety of nudges that you could use. Like, for example, you could change the matching donations. That's another form of nudge. There is a nudge for how close the project is to completion. And that could be a form of nudge, and so on. So in this particular experiment that we did, we primarily tried two nudges, the covert and the overt nudge that I was mentioning. But this is in fact what I find very fascinating. There's so many different types of nudges that you could use that it raises a lot of open questions as to what should be the goals of that nudging as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we'll have more time to discuss this in the panel. This may be a good time now to transition to Ashish's talk, if that's all right.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Krishna.
Thank you. And sorry, Ashish, for taking a little bit of your slot.
No worries. We'll have a bit of time in the break as well, so it'll be all good. Hi, Ashish, and welcome.
Hi.
This is our second keynote. The second keynote of the day will be given by Ashish Goel, who is a professor of management science and engineering and computer science at Stanford University. His research interests lie in the design, analysis, and applications of algorithms. Current application areas include social networks, participatory democracy, internet commerce, and large-scale data processing. Professor Goel has prolific work in the space of resource allocation, and he combines optimization methods with mechanism design and social choice theory. So today, Professor Goel will talk about fairness in social choice and the public resource allocation. Ashish, whenever you'd like to start your screen share.
Thank you, and Krishna, I really enjoyed your talk. So it's great that you ran over. Thank you. So thanks a lot for inviting me. The work that I'm going to talk about has actually been influenced, at least my thinking has been influenced a lot by the MD4SG group. And so it's a pleasure to present here. The talk is going to be mostly around this one issue of fairness in social choice and participatory democracy. It's been a long-term project, so it's a joint work with a lot of people. The main work that I'm going to touch upon is with Nikhil Garg and Ben Plout, but everybody else's work I might also mention along the way. So there are two types of fairness. Fairness is a very complex concept, and they're not just two types, but many types. And hence I put this in quotes. But there are two broad types that are interesting when you think about social choice. One is about fair participation, which is about people having equal or equitable voice. Yeah? And of course, these things need definitions. And the other is about fair outcomes. That is the epistemic fairness, where the focus in the second one is not so much about did everyone have an equal voice, but were the outcomes good for society in general, or fair across various groups. So one example where we personally wrestle with this quite a bit is participatory budgeting. It's a process which emphasizes the role of citizen involvement in political decision making. It's also a bit more complex than regular voting because in budgeting, there's always a certain amount of money that you can spend. So you can think of participatory budgeting as basically voting under constraints. We have a platform for this, which is open source and free. I've talked about this platform many times in many venues, so I'll skip this. Just want to mention this platform exists. It's sort of become the de facto platform in North America, at least in the US, for participatory budgeting. And we have been used in sort of over 100 elections. And as soon as you start to do something like participatory budgeting, any kind of participatory process, this notion becomes very salient, which is what is equitable participation. And there are theoretical and empirical questions in this area, but I feel like the most important questions are normative. Is it important for a civic process, for example, participatory budgeting, to have equitable distribution among demographic groups? For example, you could imagine that a random set of residents participate. How do you correct for a biased sample? And should you correct for a biased sample? And I'm going to give you some examples of situations where it's more clear that you should and some where it's not so clear that you should. And then theoretically / empirically, how do you choose such a set under two common real life situations, right? So for example, when the participants are recruited via online advertising and when the participants are self-selected. And both of them come with their own sort of complex choices. And I just want to point out that this problem is complex and worth studying, even when the organizers of the process can choose a set of participants explicitly. So even if I can go and say, well, you, and you can vote, and you, and you will not vote. Even then the problem is complex, but these normative issues are much more salient when these participants are recruited either via things like online advertising or online outreach, or when the participants are self-selected. So for example, voting in participatory budgeting in cities, and this is not just about digital participatory budgeting. This is also about if you do it in person on paper, can skew richer and whiter. And so one approach could be to correct for this proactively via tools such as neighborhood canvassing and online advertising. And we have preliminary experimental and theoretical results in equitable online advertising, for example, in last year's MD4SG. But the main questions again in my mind are normative. Which demographic should be advertised to? And this is especially complex given the intersectional complexity of the differences. So for example, often if you advertise for racial minorities and you also advertise to women, if you want to sort of, often what ends up happening is that you end up getting a lot of racial minorities who are women, where the people who are not participating might actually, for example, be African-American men. And so the simple question of which demographic should be advertised to becomes quite salient. Should we look for every possible intersection of gender and race and income and age, which becomes intractable, or should we somehow focus on specific intersections, and if yes, which ones? Should we shoot for, in online advertising, should we shoot for equitable views across all demographics? Or should we shoot for equitable spending? Or should we shoot for equitable clicks? Or should we shoot for equitable votes? Okay. And then, of course, another approach is to correct for the demographic skew retroactively. I don't want to focus on our empirical results. I want to, in this area, I want to sort of focus your attention on the normative questions. And hence, if anybody has any observations to make, please do feel free to sort of chime in or ask a question, and I'll try to monitor the chat as I'm going along. So here's an example of a situation where you could correct for the demographic skew retroactively. In general, there are processes which are structured like elections. And when things are structured like elections, generally you don't have the option of going back retroactively and correcting the results. Because there's a very strong culture with elections, which is one person, one vote, which is if somebody voted, then their vote counts. Yeah. Elections are often anonymous, so you don't actually even know who voted, right? But there are also processes which are not structured as elections. They're structured as feedback to a decision-making organization. And there often you have this opportunity to correct for the demographic skew retroactively, as opposed to proactively get a balanced sample. So here's an example. We were asked to help with the crowdsourcing Finland's off-road traffic law. This was 6 or 7 years ago. And the question here was, should snowmobilers be allowed to go on private forests in the winter when much of Finland is snowed in? And the only way to get to places from one place to another is via snowmobile. Should hunters be allowed to hunt there? And if yes, then what should be sort of the regulation that governs it? Yeah. And so immediately the question arises, should we look for demographic skews and should we correct for them in the results? And it's important to wrestle with this question sort of in advance before you actually see the results. And if you decide after you look at the results that you know you need to correct for demographic skews, then there seems to be like something normatively inappropriate around it. So in this particular case, as it turns out, we had lots of questions. We had like hundreds of questions. As you can see, there's 16 out of 101 completed. What would be the best way to situate snowmobile routes? Right? And people could sort of compare two different ideas. They could also rate ideas. So there were like hundreds of actions that they were required to do. And when you do hundreds of actions, then you can do clustering, because each person who votes gives you 100 points, or say 50 points. So they give you like a lot of data points. When each person who votes gives you that much information, you can cluster people without worrying about what the original demographic. And the name unsupervised comes from unsupervised clustering. Right? We don't actually have any upfront notion, a priori notion of what a minority is. We find these minorities based on opinion. Yeah? And then we detect these minority clusters in opinion space. And optionally, we can see whether they correlate with demographics. And the question immediately arises, should we do it? Should we report this to the decision maker? If we find demographic skew in these unsupervised minorities, is it useful? Should that be considered in decision making? In this particular case, as it turns out, the minorities that we found were the minority cluster was women, environmentalists, and landowners. And like Finland is a fairly balanced country, so there's no way women should be in the minority, right? But clearly, the people who were highly motivated to come and participate in this election were people who were snowmobilers, because this had the most direct impact on them. And in fact, for various outcomes, the red results are the results from the majority cluster, the blue results are the results from the minority cluster. So the results would indeed change, or the whole process could indeed change if we do correct for this demographic skew. Now, in this particular case, this was not very politically charged, so we had the luxury of just reporting the results to a parliamentary committee in Finland, and they, I don't quite know what they did, how they took this minority-majority issue into account, but we just sort of pointed this out in the report that we wrote. Yeah. But in my mind, even though we did it, it's still not clear in my mind whether this was normatively the right thing to do or not. Right? If a motivated minority decides to show up in a participatory process and vote far more in excess of their demographic representation, is there something to celebrate or is there something to correct for? So here's another example of the same kind of potential skew in terms of who participates. So we were asked to sort of design a participatory budgeting survey for Austin. And I emphasize the fact that this was a survey and not an election. Our platform is generally used for participatory budgeting elections. In this case, it was a survey, in the sense that the results were going to go to the mayor and the budget committee and the city planners, and we're going to publish them, but they were not going to be a binding election. And so the city sort of essentially put its entire budget in the survey, like what should we cut money for, what should we add money for, right? So in May 1, 2020, a survey launched with modest responses, an average of like 26 a day till May 28th. Yeah. And 26 sounds like a low number, but it's actually not that low. This is typically what surveys elicit. Like a few thousand responses is generally a good survey. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd got murdered. On May 28, 2020, there were protests across the US about this. There were a number of tweets about the budget survey, including the fact that police funding was on the survey. So there was like a targeted Twitter campaign to encourage people who were not comfortable with the amount of police funding in Austin or the policing practices in Austin to go and participate in the survey. And the number of responses increased dramatically. So from around 26 a day, it went to around 3,400 a day. On June 15th, we had a preliminary report which we shared with the city leadership. On June 17th, the city manager announced a series of actions to address policing. On July 13th, the city manager's budget was presented, and the budget included a 2.5% cut in police funding, which was roughly the level from the survey. So, I mean, it's hard to draw. Our survey was just one input into the decision making, right? So I don't want to claim that our survey had a direct causal connection or the only causal connection to this decision, but our survey was clearly consequential in this policy. It was definitely one factor that they took into account. And so then again, looking at the results, these are what the results look like. Right? So if you look at the first 200 responses, which were like well before the George Floyd murder, right? And the last 200 responses, which was well after all the protests took place. If you look at the first 200 responses and you focus on the Austin Police Department, you'll see this big bulb in the middle. And what this big bulb shows is that most of the intensity was at neither reducing nor increasing the police budget, but keeping it sort of where it was. And there was a small amount that people were sort of interested in, which was there's a small amount that people were interested in cutting, which was which is sort of this point on the left. In the last 200 responses, the vast majority of people who voted wanted to cut the police budget, and they wanted to cut it by the maximum allowed on our platform. We hadn't anticipated people wanting to cut the budget by that much when we designed the survey. And so you can see like a clear shift in the first 200 responses and the last 200 responses. And I think I could tell you like the demographics of the people who voted, but it'll be great to sort of, I would love to get to a point where we have a normative answer to this question without actually looking at the demographics of the people who voted, which is, should we look for demographic skews and should we correct for them in the results? And as you can see, at least my instinct in this particular situation is that the people who voted were sort of motivated by sort of deeply held beliefs, and if they came and voted, we should respect the fact that they voted or participated in the survey, and we should not try to correct for a demographic skew, right? But in general, I think it'll be useful if, as a community, if we could come up with more normative guidance on this, right? And more affirmative normative guidance. And by affirmative normative guidance, I mean not just something which gives you like high-level ethical principles that you should aspire to, but something that actually gives you concrete guidelines, yeah? And perhaps concrete quantitative measures that you could aspire to. So that was the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk is about a very stylized model which deals with epistemic fairness. Since we are running behind, I was going to stop here for questions, but since we are running behind, I'll keep going, do the second part of my talk, and then ask for questions. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to.
There's one question in the Q&A.
Okay.
All right. Can you see the Q&A? Would you like me to read it out loud?
I mean, if you could read it out, it'll be great because then it'll also be on video.
Definitely. So the question is, thanks so much for your work around participatory budgeting. Is absolutely fascinating and important. Do you think that this sort of survey platform implicitly or explicitly supports majority rule? I'm thinking about the outrage around critical race theory, which is due to the misinformation in a vocal minority.
Yes, I mean, it does. One person, one vote is generally structured like majority rule. And things like participatory budgeting do promote majority rule. And as do most of the systems that are currently structured as elections. And whether they should or not is precisely the kind of normative question that we would like to get guidance on. Right? But what would, as people who design these systems, so ideally we would like to sort of design the best possible systems that we can. As people who design these questions, we would love the normative guidance that we get to be independent of the question that's being asked on the platform. And I realize this is not always possible. I realize that this is a sort of a complex space, but to the extent possible, we would like the normative guidance to be independent of the question. This notion of sort of majority, this notion of sort of majority versus majority rule versus minority voice. And here I don't mean like majority versus minority necessarily among demographic groups. It could just be along any axis. It could be along sort of ideological axis, any kind of opinion axis. I think that's like a central question that we should answer. And these kinds of questions are generally easier to answer in an epistemic setting. So what do I mean by an epistemic setting? Where you're looking not for necessarily for equitable participation, but you're looking for equitable outcomes. Yeah. And when you're looking for equitable outcomes, then it's easier to make stylized models. And so what I'm going to do is to give you one such stylized model, right? Point out this conflict between sort of one person, one vote and fair epistemic outcomes. And then also give you one possible design that overcomes it. I want to point out that the first part of the talk raises these broad normative questions. The second part of the talk is going to be very stylized. It's going to focus on like one specific model. Can people see my screen? I should say markets for public decision making. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get this schooling to work. So imagine you are engaging in a public decision making process, and imagine that you're voting on it. Yeah. And let's assume that these there are many items on the ballot. Think of it almost like the California proposition system for people who are familiar with it. Okay. And we're going to assume a utility model, right? And you'll immediately notice this big switch from having these high-level ideas to having these very concrete notation. And this is basically often what happens when you go from the from equity in participation or from more normative ideas to sort of more stylized models of epistemic fairness. So user I, let's say, has binary preferences over the issues, right? And a weight WIL bigger than 0 for issue L. Okay. So there are many issues. The user has binary preferences over the issues, so wants this side or that side, and has a weight which is basically how importantly does it want it, right? And so I'm not going to go into more details of the utility model, but basically a user's utility is WIL on issue L if the favorite thing happens and 0 if the non-favorite thing happens. So one person, one vote, which is what the question was alluding to, generally sort of leads to majority rule. Give each person a single vote on each issue and select the outcomes which receive the most votes. It's fair in some sense. It's fair in the sense of people having equitable voice, but it lacks expressiveness because people can't actually express how important something is to them, and can often lead to very suboptimal outcomes. So here's a running example. So imagine that there are 3 issues on the ballot, and there are just 3 voters, and each issue has 2 sides. On each issue, there's 1 voter who's on the minority and 2 in the majority, and every voter is in the minority on exactly 1 issue. This is not so much, hence this is not so much about demographic minorities, it's much more about opinion minorities. But let's say the utilities are 4 when on an issue comma voter basis, when the voter is in the minority, and 1 when it's in the majority. So what that means is, in this particular case, A and B on issue 1 have utility 1, right? And C on issue 1 has utility 4. So C really cares much more about this issue. Yeah? Now, of course, if you're doing majority voting, then on every issue, side 1 will win. Okay? And then everyone is 50% off because everyone has utility 2 as opposed to 4. And this is what people often refer to, which is was alluded to, is called the tyranny of the majority, which is because you're making majority rules in every decision, you can leave the minority behind. And what this example shows is that this can actually leave the whole society worse off, not just one particular group. If you assume that when people are in the minority, they're in the minority because they have some unique need which makes that particular issue more important to them. Then you can also imagine using a market, right? So markets are sort of a true way of, are a tested way of sort of expressing your preferences, right? So you could imagine there being some kind of a market where people can express their preference on various issues. So in a market, each player has in general in a market, and this is not a public decision market. This is, I'm thinking of a goods market, like you go to the market to buy fruit. Each player has a budget that they wish to spend, and let's assume they have no value for leftover money. This is typically called a Fisher market. You assume that goods are divisible. And here we are assuming they're private goods, like what you buy, you get. What I buy, I get. It's not like a public decision setting where we all make a joint decision. And so in market equilibrium is this notion where each good has a price and each player buys a favorite bundle. And there always exists an equilibrium, and it's not immediately obvious. So the demand meets supply. So the price is such that when everybody buys their favorite bundle, then the demand meets supply. And in fact, this equilibrium maximizes Nash welfare. That is, it maximizes the sum of the log of the utilities for every player. And maximizing Nash welfare is often used as an approach to obtain fair allocations. So it's reasonable to say, well, maybe we can use the same kind of market approach to obtain epistemically fair outcomes in public decision making. So then our goal is to design a mechanism for public decision making based on private goods markets. It's going to be more expressive than one vote. And I just want to point out the one worry whenever we talk about markets in public decision making is whether people can purchase political influence. I just want to point out that this is, each person will get an equal endowment of voting dollars. So these are not people voting with real money. They're voting with monopoly money. And this money can only be used for this public decision market. There's no value outside. So this is not really about citizens purchasing political influence. It's just making a token-based market out of one person, one vote. Yes. So our first attempt is to assume that these issues are divisible / randomized. Assume that each issue has a price, and each player can use their budget to buy probability. Okay? And if there's a total, if the people on the left side of an issue buy 0.4 and the people on the right side of an issue buy 0.6, then with 40% probability you choose the left side, with 60% probability you'll choose the right side. So let's see what this simple market leads to. And now let's look at the situation where the minority side, the side with the minority opinions, has utility 1.1 when they're in the minority, but then people when they're in the majority, they have utility 1. Okay. And so by symmetry, because this thing is very symmetric, the price is going to be identical. Now, if the price is identical, let's say the price is P for issue 1. So it costs you P units of money to put your vote on issue 1 on either this side or that side. Okay. Then if you focus on, say, let's say if you focus on voter C, okay, voter C says, well, my utility here is 1.1. My utility here is only 1. So let me put my entire dollar here. B will put the entire dollar there, and A will put the entire dollar here. And so the equivalent will be 100% side 2. And in this case, everyone is 45% worse, right? And this extends to a factor of n. Because the difference in utilities was so minor, it would have been better if the decisions were all on side 1. But in fact, the decisions in this simple public market are going to end up being on side 2. Okay? And again, everybody is going to be much worse off. So just by going from 1 person, 1 vote to markets does not actually solve the underlying issue. You can solve the underlying issue using a different design. But if I could get a time check, it'll be really useful. I'm sorry, I lost track of.
No worries, Ashish. If you can wrap up in the next couple of minutes, that'd be great. So we can continue to the next session afterwards.
Okay. So in the simple market, this problem that we saw is similar to the free rider problem, which is basically when there are two people on one side. Okay? For example, focus on A and C being on the same side in issue 2. Then C doesn't want to really put their money on issue 2 because issue 1 is more important to them. Voter A doesn't want to put their money on issue 2 because issue 3 is more important to them, right? But collectively, issue 2 is more important to A and C collectively, but they can't they're not able to sort of coordinate that. They are all making their own decisions. And that's the problem with designing the simple market. And while this market might seem overtly simplified, it's actually not that. It does capture one aspect of our current society, which is that a lot of times, because voters are not voting directly, a lot of times the way voters express their opinion might be, say, for example, by going to a protest, right? Or by calling their congressman or congresswoman or congressperson. Or by writing a letter to an editor. But all these things require effort, right? So even though we live in this one person, one vote world, the way we express our political opinions is under the constraint, and the constraint is our own time and attention. And so you can imagine that while this is a very stylized example, you can imagine that this is what explains why often, this might be one reason why people often focus on somewhat fringe issues, which are not necessarily important to them, like gun rights, as opposed to issues which might be more important to them collectively, such as, say, Medicare. I'm going to sort of not describe our market design. The market design idea basically is that make everyone on one side essentially bargain with everyone else on the other side. And so there is a market design that we can come up with. It's a more complex market. The main result is that we can come up with a market design which has which can maximize national welfare. The results are in a paper. This result is actually a couple of years old by now. Okay? And since I didn't describe the actual mechanism, I don't think the actual theorem will make that much sense. Okay? But in conclusion, we can use these market design methods to design mechanisms for like fair public decision making in an epistemic sense, right? Where it's not necessarily fair in terms of how much voice you have, but it's more fair in the sense of what outcomes are achieved. And these are very stylized and complex. And so future work would be to make things which are more practical. They're easy to understand, iterative, deterministic, which are more scalable. And also we have to realize that the cognitive load of these complex mechanisms can itself be a deterrent, right? And lead to unfairness. And so simpler approaches are better. And like I said before, it'll be great to have more affirmative normative guidance, like normative principles that are sufficiently well specified that you can use them to actually design a system. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Ashish. That was a great talk. I'm really curious about these connections between the market design in your talk and in Krishna's like two-sided market too. And for the interest of time, we'll reserve questions for the panel. We'll have a panel discussion at 2 p.m. Eastern with the speakers, and which will be moderated by Michal Feldman. So thank you so much again. This was really great. Thank you for your flexibility on timing. And we'll start the next session now. We'll have a longer break right after the session. This session will be on recommendation and auditing and will be chaired by Anne Washington.
I think that's my cue to start. Okay, I'm very excited. We're right at 12:15, so wonderful job in handing the baton over in time. I'm absolutely thrilled to chair this session. We are going to hear a lot of very interesting papers, and I don't want to hold back. The title of the session is Recommendations and Auditing. And we're going to hear some interesting ways that things don't go exactly the way we think they might go. So the first paper is the stereotyping problem and collaboratively filtered recommender systems. And which author is here to speak for that? Is it Anne? No, who's?
Hi, I think it's me.
Wen Shu. Okay, yes. once you go. So you can start, and you are going to go for just about 15 minutes or so, and then I'll give you time about 2 minutes before.
Okay, awesome. Okay, can you guys see it full screen?
Yes, I can. It's
The
great.
slides? Okay.
Yes, you're good to go.
Oops.
Oh, now we can see each individual slide. And while you're figuring that out, I'll just say a note that this is, I don't have to make any, I don't have to do any air filter. Yay. Go ahead, Wenshu, you're on.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Wenshu from UC Berkeley, and this is joint work with my colleague Carol, my advisor Mike, and also Nikhil from Cornell Tech. So the project here we are thinking about is the stereotyping problem in collaboratively filtered recommender system. So first of all, why we start with this problem is because there's really a lot of wide applications of recommender systems. And in particular, recommender systems mediate our access to online information, and they also play a crucial role in many online platforms. And among many of these applications, a majority of the approaches are focused on matrix factorization techniques. So matrix factorization and collaborative filtering techniques are commonly used in practice. So just to illustrate a few applications here, which include news recommendation, online advertising, or music recommendation. So given these wide applications of these systems, we really need to care about whether they are actually fair and diverse to different types of users. Yeah, so just to reiterate a little bit, recommender system play a very important role in online information and online platforms. And I will start with some basics of the collaborative filtering technique here. So in general, collaborative filtering technique basically is trying to capture user preferences and item characteristics based on the principle that similar people might like similar items. So as an toy example here, if two users, Bob and Alice, both enjoy item 1, and Alice also further enjoys item 2, then the algorithm will try to predict that Bob is also likely to enjoy item 2. And this could be generalized to many users and items. And there are also different user-based collaborative filtering, which matches similar users, or item-based collaborative filtering, which more based on similar item types. So, so our idea here is based on actually a simple intuition of what are the limitations of this collaborative filtering principle. So basically, if we consider about it, collaborative filtering also implicitly assumes that these negative preferences are also transitive. So on one side, if I have two users who are similar and they both enjoy item 1, and one of the user, Alice, also enjoy item 2, then the system will predict that Bob is likely to enjoy item 2 as well. But on the other side, if these two users are similar, but Alice dislikes item 2, then if we use a CF-based algorithm, the algorithm might learn that Bob is also unlikely to enjoy item 2 as well. So based on this transitive preferences prediction, this algorithm might limit some users' access to diverse preferences if these preferences are different from the majority of the users. So that is what we call here as a stereotyping problem. And the idea here is if a user prefers a set of items that are anti-correlated in the broader population, then these items are unlikely to be jointly recommended to this user, regardless of this user's true preferences and ratings. And in particular, this problem may especially affect cultural minority. If other users do not like their culture-specific items, these diverse preferences are hardly to be captured by this CF-based technique. And how do we formulate this formally? So we introduced a concept called joint accessibility. And it basically means that if we consider a set of items can these set of items be jointly accessed by a user? And this is trying to capture a fundamental requirement for content diversity in recommender systems. The question we are asking here is a user able to access or be recommended any combination of top K items that they might like? And in particular, we really focus on the accessibility here, and we consider the user might have different diverse preferences over sets of items, and the algorithm shouldn't limit their ability to access these types of items if they like them. So as an overview of this work, we formally introduced the notion of joint accessibility, and also we study this joint accessibility under systems using a standard single vector representation. And based on these feature representation, we provide necessary and sufficient conditions for this joint accessibility to hold. And surprisingly, we found that actually many of the current feature representation doesn't really guarantee the joint accessibility here, and we provide an alternative modeling fix for it. And lastly, we experiment these conclusions on real and simulated data sets and demonstrate that the stereotyping problem can really happen with real data. And that's why we need to consider fixes for them in order to improve the joint accessibility of the content. So let me briefly introduce a little bit notation here. So the setting here we are considering is a top K recommendation. So in every round of recommendation, the algorithm will pick a prediction of top K items that the user might like. And also in a standard matrix factorization model, each item is associated with a unique feature vector, denoted as VJ here. And the user is also represented by a feature vector living in the same dimension. And the predicted rating is simply the inner product of these two feature vectors here. So more generally, this score or prediction will also include item or user bias, but we start with this most basic dot product prediction. So by joint accessibility, we really mean that consider a top K recommendation where this recommendation set is the top K items with the K highest ratings. A recommender system satisfies the joint accessibility if and only if for any set of K combinations, it is true that there exists a user vector where this set could be recommended. So basically, this notion is really trying to capture for any given user representation, is this set possible to be recommended or not? And also this is a really weak requirement here because we are just considering over the entire user representation space, can this set even be possible to be recommended together? And we further say that a given set S is jointly accessible if there exists a user vector such that this S is recommended. So what are some interpretation of this very abstract mathematical notion here? So the first geometric interpretation is actually pretty simple here. So on the right side, we are showing 4 items here, and they are living in a 2-dimensional feature space. So these are item 1 to 4. And we just consider top 2 recommendation. So the algorithm is trying to pick 2 items that are most likely to be liked by the user. And here we can see that if I consider the sum of the feature vector for every combination of 2 items, there is some problem with item 1, 3 and item 2, 4, because they are really living in the opposite or like half space in this feature space, and the sum of their vector is very small because of the opposite directions. And actually, we can show that if the sum of the feature vectors of K items are not a vertex of this convex hull, then this set of items is not really accessible by any users. So in particular, in this example, the pair of items 1, 3 and the pair of item 2, 4 are not really accessible for any user feature vector. And given this first geometric interpretation, there is also another alternative way to think about the accessibility. So here, I'm again showing 4 items and with a normalized feature vector in this feature space. And if we consider the Voronoi diagram of these feature vectors, it turns out that the item is only accessible by the user vector if this user vector is inside the Voronoi cell of this item feature vector. And by a Voronoi cell, it really just means all the feature vectors which are closest to this item feature vector compared to the distance to other feature vectors. And why we can see the joint accessibility problem here, because if we look at item 1 and item 3, their Voronoi cell is not neighbors to each other. And in particular, mathematically, we can show that if the Voronoi cell of 2 item feature vector are not neighboring each other in this Voronoi diagram, these pair of items are not accessible, similar to the conclusion we have for the convex Hall interpretation. So I guess in these interpretations, we can sort of see guaranteeing the joint accessibility actually is pretty hard with the single feature vector representation. And in fact, we are able to show that individual accessibility, in fact, does not imply joint accessibility, in particular for the single vector feature representation. So given this impossibility result with the single vector user representation, the alternative fix we proposed in the paper is precisely to represent each user by different multi-vectors instead of just a simple single feature vector. So lastly, we demonstrate whether this fix can help improve the accessibility of the system and whether the single vector representation really have this accessibility issue with some synthetic and real data sets. So in the synthetic data set, I will quickly describe how we created it. Basically, we manually construct a group of users, which is around 20% of the entire user set to be the minority group, and the other 80% users to be the majority group. And what we do with this 20% minority users is to give them 2 preferences or 2 preferred topics, which are different from the majority user. So what we are really trying to do here is to construct a minority user set with different preferences compared to the majority users' preferences. And then we just compute the fraction of accessibility for pairs of items over all the pairs of items in this item set. And we indeed see that after training a standard matrix factorization recommendation algorithm, the trained single vector recommendations is far away from the oracle accessibility. And in particular, this is more prominent if the item pair vectors has a lower similarity score here. And also, if we have a closer look at those predictions, we can see that if we consider a majority preferences and a minority preference, and the items that are not accessible are exactly these combinations of 1 minority preference and 1 majority preference. So basically, these 2 columns and rows on the side are these pairs of items that are never basically recommended or seldom recommended to the users. Even the minority user precisely like these 2 topics, but they're not jointly recommended together. So
okay, yeah, time to wrap up.
Thanks. Yeah, so the main message here is we considered the stereotyping problem of CF-based recommender system. We introduced this notion of joint accessibility and also demonstrate that the current CF-based recommendations indeed appears to have a poor joint accessibility over item sets. And in terms of future work, we would be interested in new training algorithms with multi-vector representation and also other alternative representation models for recommendation heuristics. With that, I will conclude my talk, and thanks for listening.
Oh, that's very exciting work. You can unshare your screen, and I'm going to ask Brianna, I think, or Solon going to speak for the next one. Very, very great work, and I love the way you were able to show that the multi-vector representation was actually a lot stronger. Very, very interesting. So Brianna, do you have slides?
Yes, I do have slides. Let me share my screen.
You can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you.
And if there are any questions, please drop them in the Q&A or in the chat line. And with that, I think you're ready to start moving?
Yeah, I'm ready whenever
you are. You have the floor.
Okay.
I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. My name is Brianna Vecchioni. I am currently a PhD student in information science at Cornell. And today I'm going to talk about some joint work done with Karen Levy and Solon Barokis about the history of audit studies and some of its implications for algorithmic auditing. So broadly, audit studies are field experiments that allow researchers to test for discrimination, where a researcher will randomize a characteristic or multiple characteristics about either real or hypothetical individuals, and will then send these individuals into some field setting to see the effect of those characteristics. And the advantage of conducting a study like this is that researchers are then able to explore scenarios and make more rigorous claims that may not be possible to answer using data that is purely observational. And interestingly, audit studies actually stem from questions about discrimination in the social sciences. And in the past decade or so, there's been an increasing push to subject algorithms to audit, right, due to this increased awareness of problematic behaviors, particularly with respect to discrimination. But this rapid growth has made the meaning of the term somewhat ambiguous, and there are many conversations about what an audit should entail, as well as what an audit should eventually deliver. So as it stands, an audit is often referred to as any empirical investigation, regardless of the fact that they often focus on very different research questions and involve very different measurement techniques. And to some degree, this makes sense due to the fact that the term audit can refer to a very broad range of activities. So some examples of these are possibly legal investigations by government tax authorities or compliance-oriented inspections by accounting firms. But again, interestingly, social scientific audits have this long history and are used to study discrimination. But even in discussions around how auditing in the social science works, there's this historical debate about what methods we should use and how to actually study discrimination. And so while recent efforts referring to algorithmic auditing have given us really important methodological recommendations and have also raised challenging questions about what algorithmic audits should or could encompass, our aim is to complement these efforts by drawing lessons from the history of audit studies, which actually originate in the social sciences. So we ask broadly, how can we draw from the history of social science audit studies when considering what role we want algorithmic audits to play in advancing social justice? And in doing this, we hope to learn lessons from the past in order to help us better reflect on the future, and in particular, by drawing from tensions within the social sciences about the aims and capabilities of audit studies. And then by describing their implications in the context of algorithmic audits and what role we want algorithmic audits to play with respect to the advancement of social justice. And we want to note that a lot of our analysis is inspired by the very valuable insights from Francis Cherry and Mark Bendick's work on discrimination auditing and the activist scholar tradition. And we do this in 2 stages. So first, we introduce how auditing in the social sciences is rooted in social justice aims. And then we provide key considerations as to what this history actually implies for us in the context of algorithmic auditing. So we're going to start with the social justice origins. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, it was very common for civic organizations to partner with researchers, which reveals its origins in participatory action research, which is basically when participants will help co-design and co-execute a study led by researchers. And this kind of endorses the with, not for mentality, where more valuable knowledge can be attained by actually directly involving the communities of interest in order to better serve their needs and their goals. And so the types of methods that were used during this time were often rooted in communities, and this included survey methods as well as audits. Community self-surveys were actually common, which is when community members themselves collect data through either in-person or telephone interviews. And the idea here is that participant engagement can help build trust and spur actionable reform. So one notable example comes from the 1951 manual called How to Conduct a Community Self-Survey of Civil Rights. And this promotes researcher community partnerships by arguing that self-obtained knowledge leads to better citizen participation. And one of the authors of this book is a researcher named Claire Seltes, who also conducted this well-known test case auditing Manhattan restaurants for racial discrimination. And in this case, testers from the Committee on Civil Rights of East Manhattan were trained and then set out into a restaurant to observe how they were treated by the staff. And ultimately, they found differential treatment by seating Black testers in more undesirable locations and providing poor service. And so action was actually then taken on these findings, which included sending letters to owners and managers, holding meetings between establishments. They issued a press release, participated in radio interviews, and more. But over time, this enthusiasm for these community researcher partnerships to study discrimination ended up waning. And one of these reasons was because they were resource intensive, right? So you have to enlist people to participate, you then have to train them, then you have to send them out into the field with these seemingly identical characteristics that then vary according to whatever variable of interest, like race and gender, for example. And quantitative modeling actually became more popular across the social sciences, which provided the advantages of more statistical or methodological rigor. And in-person audits are just hard, right? Because even if you manage to control for factors like age or physical appearance and features that are similar, it's still entirely possible to exclude relevant differences between testers, which can ultimately confound the study. And so by the 2000s, housing and employment applications increasingly took place over the internet. So researchers began conducting more correspondence audits. And correspondence audits afford researchers increased control over the variables and can also be conducted at a much broader scale. So this design enables researchers to rely on fictitious correspondence by creating fictitious individuals, either online or by mail, while varying the characteristics of these applicants in order to test for discrimination. So one very famous example I'm sure all of us are familiar with of this correspondence audit is by Bertrand and Mullinathon. And in this study, researchers sent out 1,300 job ads through fax and mail by sending 4 systematically varied resumes to employers, and ultimately found that resumes from Black applicants were about 50% less likely to receive a callback than white applicants. And so this was important that it demonstrated scale that was unprecedented at the time, showing that large-scale correspondence audit could be done with only a few researchers, right? Well, it's important to note that correspondence studies, of course, face their own methodological limitations and what we can learn. And that ends up being instructive for algorithmic audits, which is what we're going to talk about next. So now we're going to talk about the key considerations for the future of algorithmic auditing. And our first observation is that social science audit studies can make claims only about discrete moments in time where bias can emerge in the process. So for example, a lot of correspondence studies related to hiring focus on the decision to call back an applicant for an interview based on their resume. However, earlier and later processes of the hiring process are actually not captured. And so while correspondence audits have the benefits of being rigorously controlled, as well as demonstrating effects that are statistically significant, they really only offer what we're referring to as this thin slice view of where discrimination may occur in a process. And similar concerns arise in the context of algorithmic auditing. So some scholars argue for the investigation of the entire system for a criterion such as fairness, which motivates the potential for end-to-end audits that can then account for operational and social aspects of use alongside these technical considerations. Algorithmic audits which claim to have met some criterion, such as fairness or quality, then assume the best case scenario, but there's actually ample evidence that suggests that these best case assumptions about how an algorithm is used may not actually hold up empirically. And so the key point here is that audits might be most meaningfully deployed to assess bias in actual and not optimal conditions of end-to-end use. And lastly, audits typically assess episodic incidents of discrimination. So for example, one job search or one credit application, instead of discrimination that may accrue more cumulatively. And this is important to consider, given the fact that we know discrimination can cause harm over time and not just in single instances, right? And it's also important to consider what type of knowledge an audit seeks to produce. And for instance, you could look to assess this state of the world knowledge, which is how much discrimination is present in the labor market. And audit studies in the social sciences tend to favor this approach, which makes sense, right? Because of their emphasis on describing the world. You could also look for specific knowledge about the practices of a particular entity. So for example, an employer or a landlord or a credit provider, for instance. But algorithmic audits are not in person, and they can have a variety of forms, right? Such as sock puppets, where computers can impersonate testers, or scraping techniques, which enable then specific entities to be tracked down. And it's possible to imagine that communities affected by discrimination are actually less interested in this state of the world knowledge and more interested in knowledge which can be targeted at specific institutions where discrimination has been identified, because it can then support subsequent action. And these goals lead to very different study designs. So oftentimes contemporary audit studies are unpaired. This is when the treatment and control testers are sent to different recipients who are chosen randomly. And then the outcomes are statistically analyzed to assess the amount of discrimination that is experienced collectively. And when conducting a paired audit, a recipient evaluates two applicants who are matched on all characteristics, except for this variable of interest. And Cherry and Bendick make this note about how unpaired audits are subject to this villainy without villains problem, and that they don't identify specific discriminating decision makers, which is actually not the case for algorithmic audits, right? So algorithmic audits often do focus on an identifiable system, which then enables the potential for this social activist use. And it's also worth noting that in-person audits provide more of a narrative in that they can convey stories and statistics. And some of the well-known algorithmic audits have relied on storytelling as well. And so I'm going to use arguably one of the most famous examples, the Compass Risk Assessment. And even though this is not formally considered an audit, this is the case where, for those of you who are unfamiliar, ProPublica combined this statistical analysis with stories from actual individuals who were subjected to its decision-making, right? So unlike in-person audits, no real person is subjected to biased treatment in correspondence studies. So there's this trade-off between in-person and correspondence studies, because ultimately you lose the abilities to tell stories you get from this in-person approach. And we argue that a combined approach may actually lend itself better to policy impacts that are able to better support social change and serve community goals. And so it's also reasonable at this point to ask what meaningful community engagement could look like in algorithmic auditing, and specifically how researchers could collaborate with communities when designing and executing these approaches. And so one way where this might be effective is through crowdsourced audits, where researchers ask for participation from volunteers who can then share their data with these researchers. And so one example here is the use of the GDPR's subject access rights, where any individual can get a record of their personal data and how it's been used in any automated decision-making systems. And then these individuals can then donate their data to researchers so that they can use these data in aggregate when they're auditing for discrimination. Another option is through bug bounty programs, which is a crowdsource-based model that offers researchers financial incentives for identifying security vulnerabilities. And so one example of this is Twitter's Algorithmic Bias Bug Bounty Challenge, which was launched earlier this year. And this asks the researcher and hacker communities to help identify bias in their image cropping algorithm. And this was actually a result of an organic audit, which we identify as a community-led effort that arises when bias is perceived in a public-facing algorithm and is often disseminated through social media. And this was also the case when researchers took to Twitter to test this image cropping algorithm for racial bias. So ultimately, it's important for researchers and practitioners to consider how to balance community-based and researcher-led approaches. And so the advantages of community-based auditing include things like being able to reveal potential biases or test cases that may be overlooked by internal auditors. It also helps to foster community awareness as well as mobilization, and therefore greater public accountability. And we want to encourage further exploring how to combine community-led and researcher-led approaches in a collaborative way, possibly by using the community to surface suspicious cases that can then become the basis for more rigorous studies by researchers. Another idea is collecting data from a representative panel, for instance, which then gives the researcher more control, and then that they can address concerns about not selecting test cases in a way that's more systematic. And so we want to end with a few takeaways. Our main takeaway here is that there's actually a lot of value in learning about the history of audit studies and that it helps us surface considerations that those who audit algorithms should be attentive to. And based on this history, we want to be asking all sorts of questions, like how to define and measure discrimination, how to consider the advantages of involving real people, and how to enable meaningful engagement from affected people and communities. So I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Oh, that is wonderful, Brianna. You can unshare your slides, and I'm going to ask Alex to start sharing his. I just want to make a point that that's very important work to think about community-based auditing, especially in this era where it is so hard for researchers to get access to certain types of slides. And that would be one way to move things forward. Okay, Alex is sharing his slides and we can see it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful, great. Alex, you'll have about 15 minutes and I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, let me unmute my video. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk here. My name is Alex DiCristofano, and I'm a PhD student in computational and data sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. I do want to make clear that while I'm the one presenting today, the project that I'm going to tell you about is the result of a collective effort from a large group of volunteers and community organizations. And without even one of them, this would not have been possible. So that having been said, let me tell you a bit more about our team and the organization behind it. This project is a part of a working group called Grief to Action. Our members come from all over, but Grief to Action is a part of the Center for Analytical Approaches to Social Innovation at the University of Pittsburgh, or CASI. While CASI was founded in 2019, Grief to Action was created as an open call to meet and talk after George Floyd's murder in May of 2020. Our goal broadly is to support existing local efforts against systemic racism through community and student-built data platforms. People have mostly learned about us by word of mouth, and we've had over 150 people come to at least one meeting, all but 8 of which are volunteers. Right now, we've got about 30 active members across 2 projects. The first is the Allegheny County Policing Project, which launches at the beginning of next month, which at its core is a library of over 100 police contracts for the county which contains the city of Pittsburgh. This is a first step towards empowering citizens by making it easier to understand both the legal obligations of police officers in their area, as well as the formal process for filing complaints. The second is the project I'm here to talk about, 412 Connect. This is a platform whose driving purpose is to connect Black-owned businesses to the Pittsburgh University student community through social media and online discovery. To start, I want to just very briefly motivate our focus on Black-owned businesses. This is twofold. Historically, among other inequalities, Black-owned businesses have been segregated and have had less access to financial resources in comparison to their white counterparts. And these disparities have only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, with Black-owned businesses closing at a rate of more than 2 times that of their white counterparts. So now that we have a general idea of who we're trying to help, I want to give you an idea of how we approached building the platform that I'm presenting today. And maybe the first thing to say is that we did not set out to build what is now 412 Connect, but rather started exploring different solutions through an iterative process. We met once a week as an entire group, and this was a time where, for instance, community partners, our tech development team, and institutional representatives could all interact together and get a better understanding of each other's perspectives. Then we split off during the week to work with our respective teams, and then we come back the next week with questions, with solutions, with concerns. And we kept doing this until we ended up with a project we believed was not only well-defined, but in concert with existing non- and for-profit organizations in Pittsburgh, which have been working to help amplify and grow minority-owned businesses long before we entered this space. One of the things our community collaborators did early on was to conduct a survey to try and understand some of the goals of Black business owners. And some of the key takeaways were that while these businesses were generally looking to reach new customers and connect with their communities, they especially felt disconnected from the university community and wanted to improve this connection. And we see that some of the themes from the survey also appear in the geographic distribution of businesses in the university community. On the right, you can see a map of Black-owned businesses in Pittsburgh, which we've made in collaboration with our community partners. And the shaded area is the University of Pittsburgh community. And you can see that a significant proportion of businesses sort of fall outside this area of influence. After conducting our business survey, we wanted to try and understand the other side of this connection, namely university students. What we found was a little interesting, although perhaps maybe not completely unexpected. Although almost all respondents said they wanted to support Black-owned businesses, only half could actually name a local Black-owned business. We also saw that a business's online presence was important to students. It was something that they were looking for when exploring new businesses, and it was a way that many of them were willing to interact with businesses, especially because it removed some financial and geographical constraints. Once we had learned something about the Black-owned businesses and university students in Pittsburgh, we thought about what was missing, what we could help facilitate. This involved not only thinking about what we could or wanted to do, but also being cognizant of organizations who have been in the space in the past and were currently still in the space. Some host business directories, while others are incubators for minority-owned businesses. We focused on the needs of Black-owned businesses, which students were uniquely suited to address. And this is how we ended up finally defining what 412 Connect was going to be. A local organization-curated platform to connect Black-owned businesses and university students through social media and online discovery. So let's outline the main functionality that we're looking for out of our platform. First and foremost, we want to have the ability to direct students to engage with businesses' social media accounts. We also want a way for students to engage with specific pieces of information about a business, which the owner feels are important for people to know. Then, because by the nature of our platform, we'll be controlling which students see which businesses when, we want to consciously create some construct which says that businesses will get similar amounts of exposure. Finally, we want people to continue viewing businesses on our platform, so we use badges to increase user engagement, and we further incentivize activity by linking those badges to institutional recognition. As an aside, we know that students have preferences for different types of businesses, but what we don't know is how those preferences affect user engagement on this type of platform. Presumably, most students will visit our platform out of a desire to either learn about or support Black-owned businesses. If these are their motivations, then will their preferences for business types actually affect which businesses they engage with? Now we can get into some more specifics of our site. This is an example of a business profile page. From here, students can complete two different types of tasks, trivia and social media. Trivia tasks are multiple choice questions about what makes a particular business unique. These answers can typically be found on a business's website or social media pages. Social media tasks direct students to follow a business on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. To get to a business's profile page, users navigate through their dashboard, which is where they're directed at sign-in. If you look at the image on the right, you can see that at the top of the dashboard, we show a student's current badges, along with the current progress towards the next badge. We have two badge types, each representing one of the types of tasks that can be completed. The Community Explorer badge corresponds to the trivia tasks described on the previous slide, while you can get a Social Amplifier badge by completing social media tasks. At the bottom of the dashboard, you can see the business display, which is composed of a series of business cards, each displayed one at a time. Clicking on that card takes you to the business's profile to complete tasks. Because this display is how students are exposed to businesses on the platform, it was important to us that we consider the order in which each student was presented with these businesses and how it could affect engagement. Now we'll go over how we did just that. The main idea is that we model the probability that a user will interact with a business based on its place in the display. And we use that to keep track of the expected number of unique interactions for each business. When a new user comes in, we choose a display order such that these expected interactions across all businesses are maintained as closely as possible. The only caveat is that we built in a randomized experiment where, with equal probability, we either respect or do not respect a user's preferences when determining their display order. If we respect a user's preferences, then all in-preference businesses will be displayed before those out of preference. Otherwise, preferences are disregarded. This helps us answer the question posed earlier regarding the importance of user preferences over business types within this specific context. We've talked about what we're awarding badges for, namely trivia and social media engagement, but we haven't talked about how we decide when to award badges for progress. So how do we set our badge thresholds? When we built our model of badges, we thought about them as refreshing a user's motivation to engage with the platform. The results that we got match a lot of our intuition for how badges work in practice. For instance, the work required to get to the next badge increases with each badge obtained. However, the maximum possible amount of work required to get to another badge is bounded. And lastly, the marginal increase in expected number of clicks decreases with each badge added. What this means in our application is that a small number of badges with nonlinear increasing thresholds is good. Something that we were really fortunate to be able to do outside of modeling was to be able to link our badges with a form of non-academic credits at the University of Pittsburgh called Outside the Classroom Curriculum. And so by leveraging this existing university structure, we were able to add another tangible incentive for students to participate. As we thought about how to recruit Black-owned businesses to our platform, we reflected a bit on university community work that's been done in the past. Specifically, the fact that universities have frequently created projects which replicate work that is already being done, or they end up diverting funding away from the communities they set out to help in the first place. And as a result, the community can end up feeling harmed by this attempt. In our specific case, there already exist community organizations working in Pittsburgh, specifically with either minority-owned or Black-owned businesses. So we approach and work with these organizations in both recruiting businesses to our platform and our development process. And overall, this curation model is an acknowledgement that there are many community organizations in this space. They know Black-owned businesses much better than we do, and what we should do is elevate and not replicate their work. So using the curator model, we recruited Black-owned businesses, and we actually just finished up our first launch. We ran for a month from around the start of this fall semester to a couple of weeks ago. We had 8 participating businesses and 139 students using our platform. And now we're at a stage where we're going to look at the data we collected, start to understand how students are actually using our platform, and ask ourselves, do we need to update our badge model? Is there an implementable display algorithm which will provide a more equal distribution of actual business engagement? And we also just don't want this to be for only University of Pittsburgh students. We're in the process of recruiting and engaging with other schools in Pittsburgh. And we're planning to launch again in February of 2022. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you about 412 Connect and the type of work we're trying to do here at Grief to Action. I just want to reiterate how much the success of this project has relied on the efforts and invaluable input of a huge group of people coming from all different backgrounds. If you're interested and you want to join us, please don't hesitate to reach out. Whatever your skill set, there's a place for you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Wow, that's very, very interesting, Alex. And thank you for responding in time. I am actually hoping that there's a larger break at the end. So Jan, I think I'm going to have you come up immediately, and then maybe we'll have a few minutes to share. So if you could share your slides, but I'll just say that Alex, what I really appreciated was how the other piece was talking about community engagement, and here you are really actually modeling it. So I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a conversation. So presenters, please stay online and with us so we can have a short, brief chat towards the end. And Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this conference. Thanks so much for having us. Very fortunate to be on this very impressive panel today. I will talk about regulating algorithmic decisions today, which is joint work with my colleague Laura Blattner and with Scott Nelson from the University of Chicago. I'm also posting a link to the full paper in the chat, and as a trigger warning, this is one of those 50-page econ papers. So just that you know what you're getting into before clicking on that link. So the background to my talk today is that many high-stakes decisions rely on some prediction algorithms. And when these are deployed, there are often incentive conflicts between agents building prediction functions and principals overseeing their use. So typical examples would be in medical testing, for example, an insurance company that worries about over-testing in hospitals, could be in hiring where an employer may be concerned about the equity of job offers made, or, and this is going to be the example I'm going to use in my talk today, in lending, where we also have an empirical exercise that I will show in the very end, where a financial regulator may be concerned, for example, about excess risk of models used by lenders or about the fairness of credit allocation decisions. And so our paper today is going to be about the question, how should we regulate black box prediction algorithms that may be too complex to be described completely? And specifically, I will ask the question, how explainer tools that have become available over the past years can help address challenges in overseeing the fair and safe use of algorithms. To preview our main findings, we will argue that in a simple model that I will illustrate with an example today, restrictions that heavily restrict the functions that can be used ex ante, for example, restricting lenders to very simple models that are easy to describe, are typically inefficient as long as the misalignment between the agents is relatively small relative to the variation in the states of the world that I want to be flexible with respect to. Second, that algorithmic audits can align incentives if they are designed in the right way. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today, where I want to talk about 3 ways in which these algorithmic audits could happen. First of all, we could simply look at realized outcomes, where we will argue that doing only that is limited. Second, we could use explanation tools, where I will argue that the design of those explanation tools is going to be crucial to their success. Specifically, I will show that standard explainers that focus on prediction quality may not be the right tool to use here, while targeted explainers that focus more specifically on the nature of misalignment and the nature of the specific problem that we want to address may be more successful. And I then want to argue that these insights actually matter by applying them on a large-scale real credits bureau data set, where we will discuss implications for analyzing disparate impact. So let me set up our model, and the paper is a very general model. Today, I want to use a very stylized model in the context of lending. The model has 4 stages. The first step is a rule setting stage, where the regulator sets the rule of the game. Second stage is a training stage, where a lender learns the relationship between different features available in the data and the probability of default, and then uses those to choose a credit scoring function that is then used to allocate credit. In a third deployment stage, the consequences of deploying that function are realized. So for example, I'm using the credit score to allocate credit, and then I'm asking what kind of disparities does that create, or what kind of overall systemic risk does that bring with it. And the final stage is an audit stage, where the regulator performs an audit and checks whether that allocation is compliant with the rules that the regulator set out, and payoffs to the players are realized. So why could there be conflicts of interest here? We assume that there can be misalignment of preferences between regulator and lender. So specifically, I'm focusing on 2 examples here. I assume that there is some point that both may agree over, which here would be that the relationship that the lender learns from the training data set accurately represents the relationship between features and default. However, in addition to that, there may be some additional preferences that separate the regulator and the lender. So in this specific example, I assume that in addition to the credit score accurately reflecting relationships with default, the regulator may also have a preference for an allocation that ensures that there is not too much or no disparate impact, while the lender may also be able to get additional profit, for example, from giving out subprime loans that may have a high profit margin, but in the eyes of the regulator may be problematic, or may be considered to exploit some of the borrowers that get those loans. And so that means that while these preferences are partly aligned, we assume that they have some parts that are misaligned, where the regulator would want to choose a different allocation than a lender, but it's a lender who initially observes the training data set and chooses the complex prediction function, which creates a conflict of interest here. So the first thing we could do in this game that I outlined here would be to simply observe the outcome that actually is realized, and for example, audit based on the realized consequences. So think of this as I wait until the allocation of credit has happened. I wait until the lender has given out credit. And based on that, I audit, for example, I punish the lender if there's excess disparate impact, or if there's an excess number of defaults among subprime loans. So in our model, it turns out that auditing only based on realized consequences without any deeper understanding of how the allocation has happened is generally inefficient. So why is that so? That is because a bad outcome, which I'm signifying by those frowny smileys on the right here, could either be due to the lender having taken a choice that we don't like, having chosen a bad prediction function, or it could be due to a random realization of the state of the world where, for example, we're going into a recession, everything gets systematically more risky, therefore there's excess risk. That doesn't have to do anything with the choice of the lender, but is only due to external circumstances. And therefore, if I were to regulate only based on the realized consequences, that would enforce an overly conservative choice by the lender that would generally be not in the interest of the regulator because it would actually reduce rather than increase welfare. So therefore, I now focus on other tools that we could use in order to restrict the choices made by the lender and align them with social preferences. One thing I could do is, for example, simply restricting functions ex ante. For example, say, well, I don't actually want you to use very complex machine learning tools because they're problematic. Instead, I want to use you to use very simple functions that I've restricted to reduce, for example, their disparate impact. So relative to the case of not restricting the choices at all, which lead to very low or no alignment, such ex ante restrictions would be able to align the choices. However, they come at a cost of flexibility. And I don't mean like efficiency in a profit way here. I don't mean we are trading off efficiency. I only care about welfare in my case. But what I mean by that is that if we restrict the function ex ante, then the lender can't actually find very good prediction functions, can't find very good credit allocations, and can't adapt to the world as it is and the training data as it is, which may actually destroy welfare. And so in that case, while this may align preferences, it may actually destroy a lot of welfare by being overly rigid. Therefore, I now want to focus on a second policy tool we could use, which is using explanations. So in our model, we assume crucially that the prediction function that is fit by the lender in training is too complex to be described completely. But we assume that there may still be a possibility of learning something about it by using some explanation of that. And the nature of explanation in our model is that it is a low-dimensional representation of the complex function. So in this very stylized example, the fully complex model is simply 4-dimensional, and the explainer is a 2-dimensional projection of that 4-dimensional model. But you can think of this more generally as a complex machine learning model that I try to explain, which is inherently a dimension reduction in the complexity of the description of my model. And I now ask, how can an audit based on such an explanation help us to improve welfare? And the first choice that I want to point out here is that when we write a simple explainer for a complex model, we inherently lose information, which means that we lose information about some dimensions of the model while preserving some other models. And there's therefore inherently a choice how we do that. For example, in this 4-dimensional example with 2 variables, where our explainer is 2-dimensional, we could, for example, cut the data either by one of the variables or the other of the variables, leading to 2 different kinds of explainers that focus on 2 different aspects of my model. Specifically, we focus here on the one that preserves most of the predictive information, which would be the typical way you would do that if you ran an off-the-shelf explainer tool, versus one that is more targeted and focuses on specific aspects of the model that are relevant for the welfare outcome and the misalignment of interests. And in that context, we show that using that prediction explainer partly aligns choices while preserving a lot of flexibility because I'm not restricting the choices of the lender ex ante. However, this is still inefficient because the typical explainer focuses on the first order behavior, but not necessarily on the first order source of misalignment. If instead we use an explainer that is more targeted towards the source of misalignment, we can both improve our alignment and we can at the same time ensure that there is still enough flexibility. So what's the main takeaway from our model? Very intuitively, the main takeaway is that the moment that we are not able to fully describe a complex model anymore, we inherently lose information when we use simple explainer tools. And when we use those tools in regulation, it is therefore important that we keep the right information and don't lose the wrong one. So specifically, when we think of this complex model, which I've signified by this like fully interacted model here, there are different ways of simplifying it when I think of simple explanations. And those will not be the same for regulation. And those may also be different from what I would want to do if I simply want to describe the first order prediction behavior. To convince you and to wrap up my talk that this is actually meaningful, we now implemented this on a large scale credit data set, where in this case, our data set has 50 million credit applicants, but we are only using a 50K subsample for computational reasons in those preliminary results I'm showing you right now. And here I'm considering a lender who simply wants to minimize prediction loss, a regulator who is interested in well-fitting prediction functions, but also has some additional social preference. In this case, the regulator wants to ensure that there is no excess disparate impact. And then we consider a lender who, rather than just minimizing prediction loss, also has the constraint that their explanation must conform with an explanation that the regulator agrees with. We construct our explainer with a simple linear proxy model here, where variables are chosen by lasso, either in a prediction optimized way by predicting default, or in a more targeted way where we predict group membership. And we implement this with a neural net with 2 hidden layers and 40 neurons on 50 covariates, and contrast that with a very simple model. And our main question is now, how is that going to affect both the fit of our model and how is it going to affect disparate impact, which we define here as the average difference in credit scores that is achieved for minority versus non-minority applicants. And here are the main takeaways from those numbers that I won't have time to go over in full detail. First of all, our complex model with an explainer can improve welfare relative to a simple model. So in other words, going from the case where I use a very simple model, which would be like a very restrictive way of restricting a lender, to the full neural network actually improves welfare. Second, those more complex models upfront come with a cost because they allow for larger preference misalignment. Because there's now more flexibility in the choices of the lender, there may be a larger room for increasing disparate impact that may be problematic. However, our targeted explainer here is able to close that gap and achieves basically a level of disparate impact that is similar to the one that the regulator wants to achieve in the regulator's preferred option, while also leaving the choice of the complex function to the lender. So let me now summarize. First of all, our paper happens in a broader context of discussions around fairness, but also explainability, interpretability, and transparency of algorithms that we think are central to safe and fair implementation of machine learning. However, these terms often lack a very clear definition. So we all agree that explainability, interpretability, and transparency are good properties to have, but it's not necessarily clear what exactly those terms mean in a specific context. So we try to tackle that question in one specific application, specifically in an economic model with a principal-agent conflict. And we answer the question how we should regulate black box algorithms that are too complex to be fully described by saying that we should regulate them based not just on explainers, but on specific targeted explainers. And with that, thanks a lot again to the organizers for having us, and thanks to the audience for listening to our talk.
That's great. Thank you, Jan. And thank you for managing to get all of that in time. I know that we're right at the need of having a break, but I thought it would be great to just have a few moments of a chat. There is a very interesting question for Wen-Shu in the Q&A, and sadly, she is not here to answer it. But I wanted to go back to, I just see a parallel between Jan's paper and Wen-Shu's paper, and then also Brianna and Alex. And Brianna or Alex, I was just wondering if you wanted to say a few words, either of you, about engaging the population in doing this kind of audit work, and what either your own experience of doing that or something about your work. Alex, I think you wanted to jump in since you properly reserved a few minutes of your time.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I think sometimes when we think about doing research, at least for me, I sort of think about it maybe as being like very temporally linear. So there's work that you're building on or that you've done in the past, and work that you're doing now, and sort of some of your plans for the future. But I think when you're working with communities and you're working with all these relationships, they're never necessarily behind you, right? Especially in the context of the way that communities and universities relate to each other. So these effects in this broader relationship is always ongoing and changing. And for me, I think I've had to do some work to change my lens and sort of realize that my work is part of this broader sort of context and this broader relationship that I'm trying to maintain and grow.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that part of what we're doing this work for is to try to understand some of those relationships.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in also. I see like a clear divide between the solicitation of asking the community to contribute. So the things that I mentioned in terms of like voluntary collaboration, like bug bounties and things like that, versus this like more organic process, right, which is born out of more widespread public concern about discrimination within a system. So I also think it's really important to work with the community to audit systems with a greater focus temporally, right, as opposed to just looking at like a certain snapshot of data, which is what we see a lot of the time now. And I think it's also really important to note that researchers should not put the onus on communities to solve the problem, right? While also paying respect to these community contributions, right? Even if they don't always look like a traditional experiment. So it's really important, I just want to emphasize, to balance the different goals between researchers and community while also paying respect to the community members themselves.
Oh, those are really great points, both of you. Thank you. Wenshu is not here, but Jan, I was particularly interested in your research as someone who's been studying how the financial services industry has taken to new forms of private governance and regulation, and understanding some of these ideas and being able to make it actually mathematically different. So Wenshu's paper was really about seeing that there is a stereotyping effect. So I was just wondering if you had you applied it to this one case of doing credit, but are there some other applications out in the world that you've thought of applying your work to?
I think in general, there are many areas where, oversight over algorithms is super important, because in the end, we do have goals that are not necessarily reflected by whoever is using that algorithm. I think hiring comes to mind as one area where there is strong equity considerations as well. That said, I feel one reason actually why we're doing this in financial underwriting is that it takes a tremendous amount of work to understand an area well and be well mapped to the specific institutional constraints and all the stakeholders in that area. So for example, for our studies of financial markets, where we're also partnering with FinReg Lab, which is a DC-based think tank in that area, we actually build a large advisory board with community stakeholders to make sure that we understand the specific concerns in that area. And so while our paper may look very mathematical, I think it's super important to actually understand the specific area in order to be able to provide solutions that can actually move us forward and involve all the stakeholders. And so this is why I think, mathematically, in terms of the structure, our insights very much generalize. But I think it takes a lot of work to then actually tailor them to the specific area, because that involves involving stakeholders and not just, the mathematical modeling aspect of the work.
Right. Oh, that's brilliant. Well, I'm really glad we all got around to some of those interesting points about how research and communities can work together. And if we are going to improve, do proper auditing and recommendation, that's just going to happen. Wonderful papers. I hope you go off and read all of them. With that, I'm going to hand it over to people who know what they're doing. And I just need to do a shout out to the amazing team who pulled this together. Really, really impressed with all of you. And with that, I think you're going off to the next thing.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a really wonderful session. And thank you to all the authors who presented. This was a super interesting papers and discussion. And with this, we're going to head into the break. We have a break until 2 p.m. Eastern time, when we're going to have the next keynote panel. In the break, we'll also have a social gather in the social lounge, where there'll be research discussion. So please feel free to go and check it out. There'll be, each table will have different topics on research discussions. So